Yeah, that's it.
Man, I gotta tell you, these computers are tough. All right. All right, attendees in the house, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Cool. Thank you guys. All right, well, welcome to this month's edition of We Speak Linux. We have a very special guest today who I'll introduce momentarily. So, if you're here, you might know the purpose of this, but the purpose of this is to teach Windows admins and developers Linux, right, through presentations and blog posts and peer support. We have a Slack channel that you guys can get into and ask questions of us at any time. And our goal really is to grow a community of Windows admins and developers to transition to this cross-platform world that we clearly are all heading towards. So it's a very cool time in IT and computing. So today, our very special guest is Andrew Mallet, and he's going to show us navigating the Linux command line at Olympic speed. And so really that, knowing Linux under the hood, it's going to be command line almost all the time, and he's going to show us how to get proficient quickly. So just some content for you guys. Join us on the Slack channel today. If you're not on there, at #webinar_chat. That's kind of going to be our main Q&A interface. If you're not in the Slack channel, feel free to punch it into the webinar, and I'll relay those questions to Andrew as needed. And go ahead and hit us up on the webpage. Probably if you're here, you're already subscribed to the newsletter, but if you are not, go over there and subscribe. Please follow us on Twitter at We Speak Linux. And everything that we have will be recorded from a webinar standpoint and published onto YouTube for you guys to consume at a later date and time and practice. That's the important part. Actually go do this stuff, right? So we have 2 more webinars on the schedule. Next month, Whitney Champion is going to present We've All Heard of DevOps, but what does it mean? And that's going to be next month. And following that, we're going to have Calculating Top 10 Lists in Bash and How I Used Bash to Hunt a Virus by Thomas Limoncelli on June 7th. So with that, I think I'm going to pass control over to Andrew, let him take the reins and get started. There you go, sir. Do you have control?
I have control, and welcome to everyone. Let me just grab my screen. So you should be looking at Linux console. Is that what we see at the moment?
I see it.
Yeah, well, let me just bring the slides up. So today we're going to be taking a look, as Anthony introduced, by navigating the Linux command line well at Olympic speed, or being able to effectively move quickly on our Linux console. So first of all, a little bit of an introduction who I am. So I started off in YouTube about 2009. Currently, we've got about 7 million views and 44,000 subscribers. On Pluralsight, I write some courses, including the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator. I've got 32 courses or so on Pluralsight. And for other times, I run on-site training, online training, or a classroom training where I will rent out rooms, usually in London. When we look at why people want to learn Linux, they're often not worried about necessarily the command line. They want to get in with the good stuff. So things like OpenStack, things like Docker containers, playing around with the web server, so Apache, or even, of course, now as we've got the SQL server. So all of these things are the cool stuff that people want to learn. Unfortunately, like many other operating systems, there is a little bit of a learning curve to be able to really work effectively with any of these products that we're looking at. So really, we need to start with more of the basics. So working with the command line, our shell environment. Now we have different shell interpreters. We'll be looking at Bash in these, and Bash is probably one of the most common shells that you're going to find. But think of shells a little bit like cmd.exe compared to things like PowerShell.exe. Well, yeah, they're just shells, but they have different functionalities. Things like the tar command for archiving files. Things like grep for being able to search text files. How many times have you had a long configuration file with maybe 300, 400 lines, and you've been searching through that to see if an option is turned on? Well, obviously with something like grep, we can easily search that file and just see, even without opening the file, whether the value is there. We can even edit the file systematically and maybe even script using something like sed, the stream editor. With this, then I can script edits across 4 or 5 servers or even more without actually having to open up the file on each of the servers. So sed is our stream editor and can make changes to files, whereas grep is used to search for files. Sed is used to edit the files programmatically. And of course, both grep and sed work on regular expressions. Regular expressions, they're all of the horrible things that you might see, the hash symbol, the exclamation mark, whole load of different types of brackets, so braces, brackets, and parentheses, all of which have specific meanings. So it looks a little bit like Batman and Robin having a fight around a street corner when you read a regular expression. But it's like any language, once you understand what it means, it becomes easier to use. So we're going to look at some of these things today, but we're going to keep it relatively simple and looking at how we can move around on the bash command line really effectively. So we're going to be taking a look at how we can use our bash history, look at how we can move on the command line, move to the beginning, move to the end of the line, those sorts of things. And all of this is then getting you to be able to run around your command line like the veritable bee that you would want to be. When we look at, say, summarizing commands, as an instructor, this is really useful for me. So yeah, I might change to my home directory with cd. We might create a subdirectory, change the owner of that subdirectory. So here we're changing the owner of directory 1 to be sudo. If we then go through and do something like this, we can go through, list the directory, so list the properties of that directory. But if I want to then summarize a little of what I've done, I can use then history 5, which will show me the last 5 lines of history. We have to use 5. You might think, well, I only want to see 1, 2, 3, 4, the top 4 lines, but obviously history is a command itself, so we have to go history 5 to show the last 5 lines of our history. We will see some demonstrations. Let me just run through the slides very quickly, and then we'll just see some of these within a demonstration. Now, of course, if we want to recall our history, much in the same way perhaps you would within any operating system, if you typed a command, just up arrow key, you're going to be able to get through to that command. But if it was 5 lines ago or 6 lines ago or 100 lines ago, up arrowing is not going to be the most effective way of doing it. So we can look at things like this, where exclamation mark L or exclamation mark LS in this case. We're looking at running the class command that began with L or LS or whatever I put in there. So that can be very useful, especially if we need to toggle between maybe 2 or 3 commands. We perhaps need to edit a file, so we might use something like nano file 1. We edit a configuration file and then try and restart the service. We might use systemctl, find out that it still doesn't work, so we need to go back and re-edit it. So I can just use exclamation mark N. So the last command that began with N. We can use Control R to search our history. And again, we will see this from the command line and working in a few moments. The idea of this is that I can go in and search not just for the beginning of the command like ls, I can look for the last time that I made reference perhaps to the configuration directory /etc. So I can do Control R etc, and I can look for the last time that the string /etc was referenced within a command history. We can repeat the last argument with exclamation mark $, but that could be easier just using escape and dot. So for example, where we're looking at creating a directory, mukdir1, and then we want to, let's say, change the permission or change the ownership or change the group ownership of a directory, Rather than type out the directory name again, we can just go chmod, whatever we want to change the permissions to, and then escape plus dot, and that's going to repeat the last argument. So there's lots of things that we can really do to make our use of the command line very quick. And this is especially useful if you're connecting remotely. We've all tried the sort of thing where we've telnetting in or SSHing into a system, and there's a little bit of lag on the line, and it's so annoying because you're typing quicker than the display is going and you're not certain what you've typed. So the more effectively you can use the command line and the less typing you actually have to input, the quicker and less stressful that recovery of your system is going to be. When we look at using the history, then we can do, as I said, something like this: make a directory, change the group ownership, and rather than making me type the dir2 again, I could just use escape and dot. If I wanted to do that within a script, we can't do then the escape and dot within the script, but we use then our $1. Moving on the command line, again, really useful when you're remoting into a system. And if you're interested in doing any of the practical exams that are becoming available, let's say through the Linux Foundation or the OpenStack organization, their exams you remote in. So you can actually do your exam while sat at home, comfortably within your own environment. However, of course, it's a remote connection and it might not be the quickest connection. So if I want to move to the beginning of the line, rather than arrowing maybe 255 characters to the left, I can just use Control and A. If I want to move back to the end of the line, rather than right arrow 255 times, well, that becomes quite simple, doesn't it? I can just use Control plus E to move to the end of the line. I can use Alt plus B to move backwards one word. Alt plus F allows me to move forward one line. Alt and D allows me to delete the next word. Control and K deletes to the end of the line, and Control and U deletes to the start of the line. So all of it is really getting used to using some of these commands and being able to move effectively through your command line. Again, just a quick example before we get into the command line. We might want to say cat out, just list the contents of this text file here, etc services. The etc services file just shows me the list of ports and service names. I've catted it out and I realized, well, okay, there's several hundred lines in there. So I want to change the command cat to less. So I can move to the beginning of the line with Control A. I probably don't need the Alt F there to move forward, but we've got then Alt plus F moves me forward. Alt plus U then can go through and delete to the beginning of the line. Then I can go through and type less. But if we go through and just take a look at how we might do some of this, the first thing, let's go through and use the command CD. CD is our change directory. A lot of people in Linux, if you want to move to your home directory, let's just move through to etc. So they'll tell you that it's CD and tilde. Well, that does move me to my home directory. However, if I go back to CD etc, just CD on its own moves you to the home directory. So CD without any arguments moves back to your home directory. The idea of the tilde is I want to move to somebody else's directory. So if I wanted to go to tilde Bob or tilde Jane, well, I can move into Bob or Jane's directory if I've got rights into their home directory. We don't want a lesson on CD, and often we don't think we need a lesson on CD. However, look at this. If I want to go into, let's say, USR, share, and dock. Now, okay, there's a path there. It's not huge, but it's a relatively long path. But let's go CD. That moves me back to my home directory. Well, yeah, you already know that. Why am I showing you that? Because of this, CD space minus. I can toggle between directories with CD and minus. So this way, if there's a couple of directories, especially if they're relatively deep within your file system, it becomes really easy to move between these directories. So CD minus is a really good thing. Also, when you look at it now, I've got a whole load of rubbish on my screen. So of course you're confused about what you're looking at now. So of course I want to clear my screen. And you might say, well, okay, that's fine. I'm used to running this within Microsoft. You use CLS. And then I might tell you, well, it's clear in Linux. And you might say, I thought Linux was brilliant. Everyone tells me Linux is so good. But you gotta type 5 characters just to clear the screen. Well, no, I don't. That's the command. You asked me what's the command. You didn't ask me how do you clear your screen. Very different question. So I just use Control and L. So you holding down the Control key, pressing L, clears your screen. It's really useful as well, because if I'm doing something like this, mkdir to create a directory, and it's like, oh, I want this at the top of the screen. Well, Control and L moves me to the top, but doesn't delete anything from the command line. So I'm going to make a directory. We're going to create a directory. We just call it dir1. Oh, look at this. Permission is denied. Little clever boy here didn't move to his home directory. I can't be bothered typing that command out again because I'm lazy. So we can use it quite simply. Now I could up arrow key. I only have to up arrow key twice really, don't I? My last command was CD. The command before that, even though it failed, was mkdir. So I only really have to up arrow key twice. However, you all know how to up arrow key. And if there's anybody in the room who doesn't know how to up arrow key, please leave the room now. Has anybody gone? Good.
I'm watching the counter. The counter's still solid. We're good.
So if I then use exclamation mark M, we're going to reverse search the history and run the last command that began with M. So if I just go through and run that now, we've created the directory dir1. Now I'd like to change, say, the permissions on that or change the ownership. So we'll work with the group owner. The group owner is just a way of getting permissions. We can have permissions granted to the user owner. We can have permissions then granted to the group owner and then to everyone else. Permissions in Linux are not necessarily brilliant, but they're relatively simple. So I'm going to change to the group owner to the sudo group. And do you know what? Can't be bothered typing dir1. Now, I know dir1 isn't actually a lot to type, but we can imagine if that argument was a little bit longer, I just use an escape and dot. So all I did there was hold the escape key down, move to the dot key, press the dot. So the escape and dot held down together recalls my last argument. So we've now changed the group owner to dir1. When I go through and run an ls-ld so we can see what we've done through to that, again, I can use escape and dot. I've actually used 2 arguments within the last command. Argument 1 was sudo, but the last argument still was dir1, so escape and dot is still going to work for me. And we can then go through and see the user owner is Ubuntu. That's the user account that I'm logged on at the moment. The group owner is sudo. And we can see, even though the arguments that I'm using are relatively short, we can see that it's relatively easy using escape and dot to recall the argument. Using the exclamation mark, we can see that we can go back using exclamation mark M to rerun that previous command. If I want to look at what we've been doing, if I type history, and again, I'm going to use Control and L to move that to the top of the screen, just so it's easier for you guys to read, that's all. But this then shows me all of my commands that have been in history, which isn't too good. So Control and L again, and then history, and we'll do, let's say, 5 just to see what we get. But then we get to see then the mkdir, the ch group, the listing, and then the history and history 5 command that we've been showing. So again, from me as an instructor, the history command becomes more useful than just being able to rerun commands. I can summarize commands and show what we've done over the last 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or however much I can set on the screen. If I wanted to, let's just go back and see what I have in my history for the moment. So if I go through and just look in my history, if I wanted to, let's say, we can see, let's say on 329, right up near the top, we're editing the testdel.py file. So that's just going to be a Python file. And this is actually in a history that I have been working on this system. That's just a Python script that goes through to Twitter to look at deleting accounts that you follow that aren't following you back. A little bit childish, I know, but it does actually work now. I've got that script roughly up and running. But if I wanted to get back to anything that had, say, testdel.py in its name, let me clear the screen. I can use Control and R. So I'm just going to hold down the Control key, press R, and we can see then it brings up the reverse search. So if I use then test, so all I've done is type test, and we can see then that it shows me the last command that has the string test in it. Well, that might not be the one that I want. So I'm just going to use Control and R again. We get to the next one that has testdel in. And if that's not the one that I want, I can then just use Control R again with reverse search to the next one. If I hit enter, I will run the command. If I hit escape, we'll put on the command for editing. Now, maybe I don't want to use Vim. So I can use Control and A to move to the beginning of the line. We can see my cursor now has moved through to the V. Control and E moves to the end of the line. I want to move to the beginning of the line, so I'm using Control and A again. I don't want to edit this file, so we can then use my Option D, so Alt and D, and let's say we'll just list the file. So I want to cat it out. We will see then I use Control A to move to the beginning of the line, and then I used Alt and D to delete the first word. That then deleted the command vim. I could type in my own command cat, and now then as we go through and look at it, well, it's not in this directory anyway, it was in another directory. But we get the idea of actually then how we can go through and run any of this. But if I want to access it in its correct directory, then again, I just up arrow key. I've got to put a directory through to the path there for the file name. So I can then just move back a word. Now I'm at the beginning of test, so I move back 2 words there. So just using the Alt and B to move backwards, Alt and B to move backwards again. Now that I'm where I need, I can then just go through and put Twitter. I think I put it in the Twitter directory. Now when we look at it, we're able to see the script that I had been working with. How do we clear the screen? Well, we could use command clear. Keep that though for your scripts. Control and L is going to move us back to the top of the screen. So we've started seeing how we can start making sure that we can move quickly. But when we go through and take a look at the history, especially if I exaggerate a situation, imagine something like this. I use ls, so like the dir command to list the contents of a directory. That's all well and good. Then we might move to the etc directory and we list that. A lot of stuff there. Clear the screen, that's not a command, so that's not going to show my history. use then the CD by itself, ls, and then go through and just look at my history. I just display the whole of the history here. And when we look then towards the bottom of the history, we've got ls, cd, etc, ls, cd, ls. We've got an awful lot of repetition. If I run exactly the same command like ls, ls, and ls, and then up arrow key to look at my history, you can see I only had to up arrow key once the ls, and then once more to get to history. So it recorded the ls command once, but not multiple times. So again, when we look at the history, we get the history, that where I showed you we had multiple entries for ls and cd. But if you look in that history output, each instance of ls is separated by another command. Then I ran the history command, and we then ran ls 3 times. Ran history, and it only showed once. So it's a little bit clever, but not absolutely brilliant. What we need to do is change a variable, and this variable would normally be set at log on, but I'll just set it here on my command line. So I want to set his control. We normally spell that with an O on the end, and we're going to have it to equal erase dupes. With this, when I issue an ls command, it will look for all previous occurrences of the ls command within my history and remove them from my history, streamlining my history just to make sure that everything is going to work just the way that we would want it. So if I go through now and run ls, I'm only going to run it once, but go into my history now. I can see on 352, I've run ls, but then look all the way back. We've got no other occurrence of ls. You might say, oh, yes, we do. But look on line 343, ls minus ld. Well, that's not ls, is it? It's ls with some options. In the same way as if I go through and run history, we can see, I'm not actually quite, that shouldn't be showing, so I've got history showing twice. We should have removed it. I'm guessing when we look at 350 and 351, even though they look the same, one of those will have a space after them. So when we're removing or erasing the duplicates, we look for the exact match. And I think you're going to find on probably line 350, it's history space rather than just history, because all previous instances of history by itself have now been erased. And again, we can start seeing this just using CD, CD minus. These are all commands that I've run. Remember, CD moves to the home directory. CD minus moves you to your previous directory. When we want to then take a look at my history now, the history list should be a lot smaller because we've used some of those commands before, so they've now been removed. So setting the correct parameters for your history within your environment is just made up of these variables, then we can start to get a better and more effective history, because the history remains even after a log out. So of course, if I log out and log in again, I don't want to lose any of this history. I want to be able to recall all of my history. Your history is stored within a file. So each time you log on, the bash shell, the command line interpreter, is going to load your history. Again, I can go through and clear out my screen. If I want to take a look at ways that we can run different things from the command line, we've looked at ways that we can run our history. And when we look at, let's say, the history command, Remember, I can use then the exclamation mark and then things like T. If I ran exclamation mark and T here, it would go all the way up looking for a command that began with T. If I wanted to get to test del, though, we can see the command doesn't begin with T, so we have to then go through and use Control and R. We can also run things from numbers. So if I want to run the uptime command, we could use then exclamation mark 329. Obviously, it's dependent on you checking your history. But if I then go through and use exclamation mark 329, move that to the top of the screen, we go back in the history, look for the command that was number 329, and we run that. I don't tend to use that often. Main reason being is that I don't want to have to look at my history to be able to see what I can run. If I want to, let's say, look at creating a directory, then I can go through and it won't allow me to create the directory multiple times, but if I move into, so CD into one, now I can create the directory again. So if I now go through exclamation mark MK, that's going to be my mukdir. I could have just put M, but there might be another command beginning with M there. So I want to try and keep this as accurate as possible. So now when we go through, we can see we've been able then to, just by thinking, what commands have I run recently? So I say, okay, well, MK is certainly going to be creating the directory. If I didn't want to create that directory, then I can go through and use the Control and R, look for mukdir, escape, move to, well, with this, probably I want to move forward one word rather than moving to the end of the line. So I'm going to move forward one word. So with this, then I'm going to go Alt and F to move forward one word. I'm going to use then Alt and D to delete the following word. And then I'm just going to type 2. So again, we're just looking at ways that we can utilize the history. So if I've got a slow connection, I don't have to type as many characters to achieve the same thing. I don't have to use the back arrow key. I don't have to use the forward arrow key. I just get used to using these shortcut keys on my command line. When we were looking at changing the directory, remember we said that CD takes me through to my home directory, CD minus takes me through to the old directory. How does it know what your previous directory was? With this then, if we want to look at it, we can just use echo. We've got a variable. So we use a dollar and then old. If I just use tab here, we can tab complete on file names, directory names, executables, but we can also tab complete on our variables. So variables start with a dollar when we're reading the variable. So all I did was type old, hit the tab key, and then we've got our working directory, print working directory, and we can see then my previous directory that I was in was my home directory, so home Ubuntu. So we can see then when I use CD space minus, we move through to this. We set the his control variable. If we want to check that, let's go through and reset it. The quickest way for me to reset, it is set at the moment, but let's just see the command that we ran before. So if I go through and use hist, so exclamation mark hist, looks for the last command in my history, and setting a variable is still really a command, hist control equals erase dupes. But that's because I knew I had just set it. I knew it was going to be in my history. If I want to look at that variable, then $hist, hit the tab key, nothing, just beeped at me. Well, what do you do when it does nothing? You hit it harder. Hit it harder. Ah, that's better. Double tab, and it's going to show you then the matching variables in this case. But we can see then we've got things like hist command. What do we do once we have written a history or something into our history? We've got then our hist control, which is the variable that we want to look at. The hist file is where do we store our history, and then how big the file size can that history become, and how many entries do we allow in our history file. But I want to look at hist control, so I just hit the CO here. Now it will be unique, so I can hit tab once. I don't have to get angry with it now. It understands what I want. And, oh, don't want to do it here, do I? You're going to hurt your neck leaning that far down the screen to read it. So I use my Control and L to move to the top of the screen, hit my Enter key, and we can see the value that's stored in a variable. So when we're setting a variable, we don't use the dollar, we just go hist control equals whatever we want to set. When we're reading a variable, we just then allow that expansion using the dollar. The last thing on setting variables, I don't need to get in this too much, that's not really what we're looking at, but like many things, setting a variable has exact syntax. You might think this is better, white space is good. Move to my end of the line, so Control and E, hit Enter. Hist control command not found. It's not a command, you idiot. It's a variable. And you can spend hours on this and go, well, it's not working. It's not working. Well, that's because we got spaces. So white spaces are good aesthetically, but syntactically in Bash, they're not any good. So we do have to abide by the syntax rules. Now at this stage, I think I'm just about done on what I wanted to show you. We seem to have gone through, well, as I said, at Olympic speed. But if anybody's got any questions or wants to say, well, hang on, what were you doing there? Well, now's your time to answer or ask those questions.
So are there any other common Bash variables that you set up in your Bash shell that maybe aren't standard, things that are kind of like your favorites?
I don't use very much variables, always use the hist control. So there isn't a huge amount. I probably haven't changed it on this system. Let's just go through and see. If I go through and look at my editor, and this is just because Ubuntu likes to assume that you're an absolute idiot and you can't use a proper editor. It's not set on here, but I would normally set my editor to be Vim because in later versions of Ubuntu, it would default to Nano. So if I do something like sudo and visudo, visudo is just a simple way of editing a control file that's really saying, what permissions do you give Bob to do something? Mm-hmm. In a Windows environment, it's similar to when you're going through into your security manager and you're giving your users rights rather than permissions. They don't want you to edit the file directly, so they have this I suppose, control file called visudo that opens it in a template editor. But we'll see when I go through and edit this, it opened it up in Nano, which is a simple editor to use, but it doesn't have any of the shortcuts that I would find useful. And I kind of hate this. I'll just show you why I really hate this. If I go through and say, it's great, because if I want to delete something, I can just go down and say delete one of these comments. So you just backspace over it. Then you spend hours thinking, how do I save? And realize, well, okay, maybe what happens, I just go control and exit. Do I want to save my changes? Well, I would have said yes previously, but I had to choose exit because you didn't give me an option to save. So of course I want to save my changes. Which file do you want to write to? Well, of course, the file that I was editing, numpty. So I have to go through all of that. So what I would normally do then is set my editor equals then slash USR slash bin. It's actually probably just, I can't remember where it is at the moment, but if I just go through and use which Vim, we can then see the path of that. So then I can go through and go editor equals, and do you know what? I can't be bothered typing USR bin Vim. That's just too much like hard work. So we've already seen how I can find it out. If I just go through now, put in the command, which Vim, the brackets are evaluated first. We all know that, especially if you're doing anything to do with sort of programming, even like with SQL, we know brackets are going to be evaluated first. So that's going to put USR bin Vim within there. It feeds into a temporary variable, my dollar. So then my editor is going to equal USR bin Vim. Hit the enter key on that. If I want to then go through and echo that out, exclamation mark E, the lowercase e that I've done here, so that's certainly going to be then my echo dollar editor. We can see now that does have a value. So now if I go back, I'm just going to use exclamation mark and S here, reverse search my history. We can see the history on the screen there. That's going to be my sudo and vi-sudo. And that stupid thing didn't work. What I'm going to have to do, yeah, I hate doing things that don't work. It does work. Syntax error. What now? Give me a choice. Quit without exit without saving changes. So what we want to do is make sure. I just did that, didn't I? Back arrowed key, but never mind. Export my editor. That's just making it globally for any subshells, and we're going to actually open a subshell when we go in with sudo. Now, when we look at, I'm giving up on this. It might want me to log out and log in again. I'm not certain, but that now should be opening up in Vim, but I'm giving up on that. But we kind of get the idea of what I was trying to do there. So I normally set the editor variable so that any of the programs that would open up in your default editor, we can specify the default editor. But if I am getting into what control values I normally set quite a lot within my Vim template, so my .vimrc file. So I can set things like auto indent, my tab spacing, those sorts of things. So especially when you're writing code, it becomes I suppose an easier way of getting the defaults that you need.
Do we want to open it up for tab versus spaces right now, or we want to leave that off of the table?
Probably leave tabs and spaces off for a little bit, because then we get into a whole bucket load of really useful tools and getting to play with things like our octal dumps and things like that, so we can actually see our tabs and spaces. But yeah, it's for those, especially if you get into Python coding, your tabs and spaces are completely different. So yeah, we need to make sure that we're consistently writing the same. But you've got some really nice things, and this is why I like Vim rather than Nano, is we have got things like auto indent. We can move around the file, really going to the end of a file, to the beginning of a file, to line numbers, lots of macros that you can put in. So Vim, so that'll be another presentation to do, is how to use the Vim editor, because that's just brilliant. Once you know it, you wouldn't use anything else.
Yeah, I always tell folks about using Vim versus things like Nano is, when things are bad and you can't, maybe particular volumes aren't mounted, Vim's always going to be there for you, right?
Yeah.
On any system that you go to. When you're troubleshooting a system and you really need to get going, that's going to always be there. So learn Vim or VI.
And it's like the command line because, yeah, you often have to, and it doesn't matter what system that you're using, especially with virtualization, you're often going to be SSHing into the command line. But if you can't SSH into the command line, you've usually got that graphical control panel to go to your virtual machines. But that's still just going to give you then a console to connect to where you're going to have to type some commands. And
Right.
yeah, you need to learn the command line.
So Chase is interested in your terminal configuration. He is enjoying your color themes and things like that. Do you want to kind of show us how that's set up so that we can make similar configurations on our systems?
Yeah, this is actually just the default that you get with Ubuntu. Um,
Hmm.
if we can look at it in a couple of different ways. The first way that we're going to look at it is just using bash here. If I just go through and echo out a variable ps1, now that looks fairly ugly, but we've just got the color being set up. To be honest, there's an awful lot of this I could just remove and we could still have the same, but it looks for other variables and then just sets defaults if they're not there. But this is really setting up the colors. But yeah, Bash is good. Bash actually stands for the born again shell. So it's like the original Born shell, but it does more features. So hence the term Bash. So it's meant to be good, but it's not that good. If I if I go through and just exit out of this, exit is just leaving the shell. Now, you're not going to see a lot of difference other than perhaps a slight difference in the way that Open LDAP is colored the host name. But I'm in a different shell now. I just wanted to run this one in Bash, but it's not really the shell that I normally use. So the shell that I'm now in is in the Z shell. And with this, if I go through and cut out my .zshrc, when we go through here, again, this looks perhaps a little bit awkward because there's a lot in here, but this is where I'm setting my prompt. So my prompt equals, so we're using prompt rather than PS1, so a more usable variable name. And then we're setting the foreground color. Rather than using a color code, we can just use the color name. So we've got then green. We can then go through and say the background color. So the foreground is green. We don't have any background color. We then have the @symbol. So that's just my, the first part then is my username. The @symbol comes after my username. We then get the machine name. We're then going through then %F. So that's then just ending my color that I set with the uppercase here. With the colon then will be in the default color, so should just be in black. We're
Hmm.
then setting my directory through to red. So the tilde that was shown for my home directory, we turn on the foreground color. We set it to red. And then I'm just having to surround the tilde so it's not interpreted as anything, but we're then just putting in the tilde for the directory. We end the color, and then we're just ending the background color. Set then an ordinary prompt, and then we're just ending the quote. So that's pretty much what we saw within the bash prompt. Partly the bash prompt was more complex because that's just the way that Ubuntu set it by default and I hasn't changed it. But the Z shell is probably easier to read. We've got a few of these weird macros, the %F and the %B. However, they're not too bad to understand compared when you looked at it before. So if I wanted to change the color around, then it's just going to be, so if I escape out of this, go back up, I want to change my command because this was catting it. I want to edit it now. So I can then use my Control and A to the beginning of the line, Alt and D to delete, put Vim in. If I want to then go through and change this, let's go through and change this through to blue, just choosing a random color, save that. Of course, it won't have changed anything now, but if I want to read that file in, so this file would normally run when I run the Z shell. So we just source it. There is a shortcut, just dot for that, but it never looks good on the screen because people don't understand what you're doing. So I can either use dot space dot ZRC, or instead of just using dot, use a command source. But we can see now that the color has changed, and it was fairly obvious what I was doing within the prompt setup because I changed it literally from green to blue. So yeah, I tend to use the Z shell, not the bash shell, but yeah, the bash shell is the most common shell and is what most people would use on their servers. Often you have to install the Z shell. And again, when you start talking about a corporate server, you might not be able to install additional funky shells.
Right. So why, I guess, so that's your personal preference is to use Z shell or is that shell over bash? Like what are the things that drive you towards I want to say a non-standard shell?
Yeah, a lot of it. Let me just go through. If I do something like this, so if I want to use my archiving command, so kind of think it is zipping. It's not exactly zipping, but if I wanted to create a zip file, let's say, then I can create it with tar without getting into too much detail. But when I go through and start looking at all of the options, so I can put minus minus, and then I can see all of my options here. I get tab completion on all of my options without any additional scripts. If I try to do this within bash, so to open up my bash shell, I just type bash, and then we run exactly the same thing, tar minus minus, double tab. We're going, hold on, the wrong key there, but get really angry with it now, and obviously just nothing's happening now. So, and I get that from Z shell straight out of the box. So again, exit will take me back to the Z shell. Just looking at tar minus minus. So obviously minus minus, we're just putting in front of my options. And even if I wanted then to, let's say, create an archive, I just put CR and then tab, and then I get the create coming in. So generally, it's going to make working at the command line more simple, but I would err against using it too much until you're familiar with your systems and what you're allowed. Also, if you are doing practical based exams, be it Red Hat exams or Linux Foundation exams or the SUSE exams, you might not have the Z shell available to you. So yeah, learn bash and then play around with some funky other shells if you want to.
That's very cool. Well, let's throw out one more call for questions. If anyone wants to drop a question either in the Slack or into the GoToWebinar, we'll hang out here for you guys for one more second. Cool. All right. You get in some good commentary saying thank you very much. So, well, Andrew, we do appreciate your time and this fantastic presentation. I've been using Linux for years and I wrote down some tricks today that I'm going to go practice. So we do appreciate you coming out and showing us what you have.
I'm just lazy. That's the only reason I find all of these shortcuts. So, but thank you very much for having me, and I'd be honoured if you wanted me back at any time. So don't be cautious in asking me back.
Oh, be careful what you ask for. I'll definitely have you back, sir. So appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and post these on YouTube in short order. We'll probably throw a tweet out for that or put something in Slack to let you guys know that it's ready to go. So we appreciate everyone coming and have a great day.
Okay, thank you.